Evelyn Rousseau tugged nervously at the hem of her borrowed black dress, a second-hand find from a thrift store that she had carefully mended 3 times this week alone, praying no one would notice the faded fabric under the ballroom's unforgiving chandeliers. Sitting alone at table 19, practically exiled to a different zip code from the head table where her cousin Sophia glowed like a princess beside her investment banker groom, she sipped lukewarm lemon water instead of champagne because she refused to owe anyone anything, not even a free glass of wine. Across the glittering grand ballroom of the Westmore Hotel, her 4-year-old daughter Lily was having the best night of her life, clutching her flower girl basket and spinning in circles with the other children under the watchful eye of Aunt Maria, blissfully unaware that her mother had skipped dinner for 3 days straight so she could afford the gas money to drive them here. At least one of them was enjoying this affair. Eve glanced around the room, filled with strangers draped in designer gowns and tailored suits, men with watches worth more than her annual salary, women whose diamonds could pay off her mother's hospital bills twice over, then looked down at the tiny bruise on her wrist she had tried to hide with cheap concealer, a souvenir from a drunk customer at the restaurant where she worked the night shift to keep the debt collectors from her door. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, another threatening text from an unknown number reminding her that the $120,000 her ex-husband had borrowed from very dangerous people was still her problem now, and the interest was growing every single day. Just as she was calculating whether she could slip out through the kitchen exit and disappear before anyone noticed the poor relation was gone, a deep voice rumbled from behind her, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her bare shoulder, and she nearly knocked over her glass. She turned and saw him, 6'3" with steel-gray eyes that held no warmth whatsoever, and a faint scar running along his left jaw like a warning carved into flesh, and she recognized him immediately because everyone in New York knew that face. Dominic Marchetti, the man the newspapers called a real estate mogul but the whispers called something far more dangerous, was standing at her table in this forgotten corner of the room, looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. He was the last person she expected to see at her cousin's wedding. Yet there he stood in a black suit that probably cost more than everything she owned combined, the fabric stretching across shoulders broad enough to block out the light. And when he smiled, it did not reach those cold eyes but somehow made him more terrifying and more magnetic all at once. He asked if he could sit in the empty chair beside her, gesturing to the abandoned table, as if he actually wanted to be there instead of at the VIP section, where powerful men and beautiful women were practically fighting for his attention. Eve found herself nodding before her brain could catch up with her survival instincts, suddenly hyper-aware of every frayed thread on her dress, every dark circle under her eyes, every reason why a man like him should not even know she existed. Dominic Marchetti, 36 years old, rumored billionaire and alleged head of the most powerful crime family on the East Coast, had never once crossed paths with her in her 27 years of struggling to survive. Yet now he was settling into the chair beside her with the casual grace of a predator who had all the time in the world, and telling her that he knew exactly who she was, that he knew about the debt she carried like chains around her throat, and that he had a proposal that would change everything if she was brave enough to listen. If you want to know what dangerous offer Dominic made to Eve that night, and whether she was desperate enough to accept it, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel so you never miss what happens next. Share this story with someone who loves a dark romance that will keep them up all night. Because at table 19, where the forgotten and the forsaken sit alone, sometimes the devil himself pulls up a chair and offers you a deal you cannot refuse. Eve listened as Dominic spoke about his strange proposal, that she would only need to pretend to be his fiancé for tonight, for one single night, so that the eyes watching her from the other side of the room would understand that she was under the protection of a power no one would dare challenge. And she wanted to laugh in his face, wanted to ask him how insane he thought she was to agree to be entangled with a man the entire city whispered about as a mafia boss. But before she could open her mouth to refuse, a tiny voice rose beside her and squeezed her heart until it hurt. Lily had appeared without her noticing, her small hand clutching the hem of her mother's dress, her wide eyes lifted in a pleading look that only 4-year-old children have when they urgently need the bathroom but are too shy to say it in front of strangers. And Eve apologized to Dominic in a rush, without time to consider what he might think of her, without time to think of anything except her daughter. Then she lifted Lily into her arms and hurried toward the restroom at the end of the corridor, feeling Dominic Marchetti's steel-gray gaze follow every step she took until she disappeared behind the door. After Lily was done, Eve led her daughter back toward the ballroom, walking through the empty hallway bathed in soft yellow light, and as she thought about how she would politely refuse Dominic's insane offer, a staggering figure stepped out of the shadows and blocked their path, and Eve froze when she recognized that face. the face she had tried to erase from her memory for over 4 years, yet still saw in every nightmare. Michael Russo, her ex-husband, Lily's biological father, the man who abandoned her when she was 7 months pregnant, and left her with a debt of $120,000 to loan sharks she had known nothing about, until they knocked on her door demanding payment. He was drunk. The stench of cheap whiskey hit her from 3 steps away, his bloodshot eyes fixed on her with a hatred she never understood because he was the one who betrayed her, the one who destroyed her life, yet he looked at her as if she were the guilty one. Michael moved closer, his slurred voice thick with menace as he demanded to know what she was doing here, asked where she got the money to buy a beautiful dress, to attend a rich man's wedding, while still owing him an entire lifetime, then demanded she give him money right now, saying he knew she was hiding it somewhere because there was no way a woman like her could survive without a man providing for her. And Eve pulled Lily behind her, shielding her daughter with her thin body like a mother wolf protecting her cub from a predator, her voice shaking but steady as she told Michael to step aside, to leave her and her child alone, told him she owed him nothing, and that it was he who owed her and his daughter 4 years of absence. But Michael did not listen. He never listened. He only saw weakness and wanted to crush it in his hands, so he grabbed Eve's arm, his fingernails digging into her skin exactly where an old bruise had not yet healed, and she clenched her teeth and did not cry out only because she did not want to frighten Lily more. But Lily was already terrified. She did not understand why this man was hurting her mother, did not understand why her mother was shaking, and she began to cry, the cry of a 4-year-old echoing through the empty hallway like a plea for help no one could hear, and Michael shouted at Lily to shut up, his voice like thunder making her cry harder, and Eve felt rage explode in her chest as she yanked her arm free, shoved him back, and completely blocked Lily from his view, her mouth opening to scream for security when everything abruptly stopped at the sound of a voice, deep and cold as ice, coming from the far end of the corridor. Dominic Marchetti stood there, his tall frame filling the passageway, his steel gray eyes fixed on Michael with a contempt Eve had never seen anyone direct at another human being. As if Michael were an insect he was deciding whether to crush or let crawl away. And he walked forward, each step slow and heavy with threat, and without raising his voice, without loud theatrics, he said just enough for Michael to hear that if he did not leave within 5 seconds, he would make sure no one ever found his body. And from that voice, that gaze, the way the air itself seemed to freeze when Dominic Marchetti became angry, Michael understood this was not an empty threat. He released Eve as if burned, stumbled back 2 steps, muttered something no one cared to hear, then turned and fled, staggering into the darkness at the end of the hallway, like a rat escaping a cat's shadow. Eve stood there, her heart pounding like a war drum, her arms still throbbing, Lily sobbing in her arms, and she looked at Dominic Marchetti, the man she had met less than 1 hour earlier, not knowing whether to thank him or fear him, not knowing whether he had just saved her or pushed her deeper into a dangerous vortex she had no way to escape. Lily was still crying, her broken sobs echoing through the silent hallway after Michael had disappeared, and Eve held her daughter tightly against her chest, whispering words of comfort she knew were meaningless, because how could she tell a 4-year-old child that everything would be all right when she herself no longer believed it, and she was trying to lift Lily into her arms to return to the ballroom, to put as much distance as possible between them and this place, when Dominic Marchetti did something she never would have expected from a man the entire city of New York feared. He knelt down, one knee touching the cold marble floor, his expensive suit certain to be stained yet clearly of no concern to him, and he lowered himself to Lily's eye level, his voice changing completely, no longer cold or threatening as it had been with Michael, but gentle and warm in a way Eve had never imagined could exist in this man. He asked Lily her name, and when she did not answer because she was still hiccuping, he smiled a real smile for the first time that night, one that reached his steel gray eyes and made them glow strangely. Then he told her he had a secret he wanted to show her, a secret he only showed to the bravest girls. Lily stopped crying, her wide eyes still wet with tears, but now filled with curiosity as she looked at the strange man kneeling before her, and Dominic slowly slipped his hand into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a silver coin that gleamed under the hallway lights. He showed it to Lily, rolling it deftly between his fingers, then told her to watch closely, and suddenly the coin vanished, completely gone, as if it had never existed, and Lily gasped, forgetting to cry at all. Dominic tilted his head as if thinking, then reached toward Lily's ear, and when he drew his hand back, the coin was resting neatly between his fingers, as though it had always been there, and Lily squealed in astonishment and delight. the tears drying on her cheeks and replaced by a wide grin Eve had not seen on her daughter's face in a very long time. Dominic placed the coin into Lily's tiny palm, telling her it was a lucky coin, that it would protect brave girls from all the frightening things in this world, and Lily closed her fist around it as if it were the most precious treasure she had ever owned. Eve stood there, unsure how to react, because the scene before her contradicted everything she knew about Dominic Marchetti, the ruthless mafia boss the media claimed had ordered the deaths of countless people, now kneeling on the floor, performing magic tricks for her 4-year-old daughter with a patience and tenderness Lily's own father had never possessed. When Lily had completely calmed down and began babbling to Dominic about the stuffed bear at home she had named Mr. Buttons, Eve gently interrupted and said they should return to the ballroom before their absence was noticed, and Dominic stood, brushing off his knee with casual indifference, as if his suit worth thousands of dollars meant nothing, then placed a hand on Eve's back, light yet unmistakably protective, guiding her and Lily back to the ballroom through a different corridor to avoid passing the place where Michael might return. Once they were seated at table 19, Lily busy showing her lucky coin to Aunt Maria, who had just come back looking for her, Dominic leaned toward Eve and lowered his voice so only she could hear. He told her that the man who had just attacked her was not the greatest danger she faced tonight, that there were others watching her right now, people far more dangerous than Michael by 100 times. Eve felt the blood in her veins turn cold when Dominic spoke the name Victor Salerno, the head of the Salerno Mafia family, the man her ex-husband had borrowed money from, and who was now demanding repayment from her one way or another. Dominic gestured with his eyes toward a man in a gray suit standing near the entrance, pretending to sip his drink while never once taking his eyes off Eve's table, and he told her that man was Salerno's, that they had followed her all the way here, and that her appearance at this wedding had not gone unnoticed by them. Eve looked at the man, and when their eyes met for a brief instant, she saw the cold threat in his gaze and knew Dominic was not lying, and she looked down at Lily happily playing with the coin, completely unaware that her small life was in danger, and fear tightened around Eve's heart in a way she had never felt before, because she could endure anything that happened to herself, but if anything were to happen to Lily, she would never forgive herself. Eve looked at the man in the gray suit, standing near the entrance, then down at Lily sitting in Aunt Maria's lap, playing with her lucky coin, and she understood that she no longer had the luxury of refusing Dominic Marchetti's offer. So she turned to him, the man she had met less than 2 hours earlier, the man the entire city of New York whispered about as a devil wearing human skin, and she told him that she agreed, but only for tonight, only for this one night, and that once the wedding ended, they would return to being strangers. Dominic did not seem surprised, as if he had known all along she would say yes, as if he always knew how things would unfold according to his will, and he nodded in acceptance of her condition with a faint smile on his lips, whose meaning she could not decipher. He rose to his feet and extended his hand to her with the polished ease of a gentleman she had only ever seen in lavish Hollywood films, and he asked if she would dance with him, because the best way to convince those watching that she was protected was to let them see her in the arms of Dominic Marchetti before everyone. Eve stared at his outstretched hand, at the long, powerful fingers she knew could order death with a single snap, and she wondered what she was doing, what dangerous vortex she was stepping into. But then she thought of Lily, thought of the cold gaze of the man in the gray suit, and she placed her hand in Dominic's. His hand was warm and dry, closing around hers firmly, but without cruelty, and as he led her onto the dance floor, she felt every eye in the room turn toward them, as if the world itself had stopped spinning. The orchestra was playing a slow waltz. The wealthy couple's dancing came to a halt to stare as Dominic Marchetti entered the floor with a woman no one recognized, and Eve felt heat rush to her face as she realized she had become the center of attention she had never wanted. Dominic placed one hand at her waist and held her other hand as he began to guide her with the confidence of a man utterly at home on such elite dance floors. And Eve did not know how to dance, had never had the time or money to learn such luxuries, yet he led her so gently that all she had to do was follow without fear of stumbling. He drew her closer, close enough for her to catch the scent of his expensive cologne and something unmistakably masculine beneath it, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of her old black dress, and her heart began to race in a way she did not want to acknowledge. This is just acting, she reminded herself, just a performance to protect her daughter. But when Dominic's steel-gray eyes looked down at her with an expression she could not decipher, she forgot how to breathe for several seconds. He leaned down, his lips near her ear, and murmured that she was doing very well, that she was a better actress than he had expected, and his warm breath against her skin sent a shiver through her that was entirely inappropriate to the situation. She tried to remind herself who this man was, how dangerous he could be, that she should feel nothing but fear and gratitude. Yet her body did not seem to listen to reason, and she found herself leaning into him more than the performance required. At that moment, a familiar voice sounded behind her, making Eve turn abruptly and nearly step on Dominic's foot. And there stood Sophia, the bride, Eve's cousin, radiant in her white wedding gown, her eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at Eve, then at Dominic, then back at Eve as if trying to assemble a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit. Sophia asked how Eve knew Dominic Marchetti, her voice filled with astonishment, and something Eve recognized as envy, because Sophia might have everything Eve did not: money, status, a lavish wedding, but she did not have the attention of the most powerful man in the room. Dominic smiled, slipped an arm possessively around Eve's waist, and told Sophia that Eve was the most extraordinary woman he had ever met, that he was very fortunate to have her by his side tonight, and the way he spoke left Eve unsure where the truth ended and the performance began. Sophia looked at Eve with an entirely different expression than when she had seated her at distant table 19, and Eve realized that in a single moment she had gone from a forgotten poor relative to the mysterious woman beside Dominic Marchetti, and she did not know whether that was a blessing or something that was pulling her deeper into a dangerous web she had no way to escape. The wedding ended close to midnight, when the last guests began to leave, and Sophia and Marcus climbed into a limousine bound for the 5-star hotel where they would spend their wedding night before flying to the Maldives for their honeymoon, and Eve carried Lily, half asleep against her shoulder, the lucky coin still clenched tightly in her small hand, thanked Dominic in a rush, and headed toward the parking area, wanting to get away from this place as quickly as possible before she had more time to think about what had happened tonight, about the strange feeling of being in his arms on the dance floor, about the way her heart still raced whenever she remembered his warm breath near her ear. Dominic offered to walk her to her car, but Eve refused, saying their agreement had ended when the wedding ended and that she did not want to owe him anything more. Then she turned and walked away without looking back, afraid that if she did, she might see something in those steel-gray eyes that would make her change her mind. The Westmore Hotel parking garage was underground, the flickering fluorescent lights casting alternating bands of light and shadow, like something out of a horror film, and Eve quickened her pace as her footsteps echoed through the empty space. Her 2008 Honda Civic was parked in the farthest corner of the garage, where those who could not afford valet parking were forced to park, and as she approached, her heart sank like a stone when she saw her car. All 4 tires had been slashed, collapsed flat against the cold concrete, and a piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. Eve settled Lily into the back seat, locked the door carefully, then with trembling hands picked up the paper and read it under the flickering light. The handwriting was crude but terrifyingly clear. "Do not think Marchetti protects you from this. The money is due. The little girl is very cute." It felt as though someone had punched Eve in the stomach, her breath catching in her throat as she realized they had mentioned Lily, her 4-year-old daughter, innocent and sleeping in the car, unaware that there were people threatening her life. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number lighting up the screen, and though she did not want to open it, her thumb slid across the glass, as if guided by fear itself. The message contained a photograph of Eve and Lily walking through the hotel lobby a few hours earlier, taken from a distance as if someone had been watching them all night without her knowing, and beneath the image were the words "Salerno does not forget. Salerno does not forgive. The deadline is Friday." Today was Saturday, which meant she had less than a week before these people did whatever they intended to do to her and her daughter. Eve leaned back against the car, her legs shaking so badly she feared she might collapse right there, and she tried to think of what she could do, who she could call, where she could run, but her mind was empty, like a room stripped bare by thieves. She could not call the police because Salerno had people inside the department, something everyone in this area knew but no one dared to say aloud. She had no family to turn to, no friends close enough to drag into this dangerous chaos. She was completely alone, completely powerless, and for the first time in 3 years, Eve felt like crying, like sitting down on the cold concrete and crying until there were no tears left. But she did not cry. She could not allow herself to cry, because Lily needed her, because if she fell apart, then who would protect her daughter? Just then, a figure moved in the shadows at the edge of the garage, and Eve froze when she saw the man in the gray suit from the reception leaning against a concrete pillar, his eyes fixed on her with a chilling half-smile, as if he were savoring her fear as an appetizer before the main course. Eve opened her car door, preparing to climb inside even though she knew she could not drive anywhere with 4 slashed tires, because she needed to be close to Lily, needed to protect her daughter in whatever way she could, when a sleek black SUV pulled up sharply beside her car. The door opened, and Dominic Marchetti stepped out, his steel gray eyes sweeping the garage and stopping on the man in the gray suit in the shadows for a single, meaningful second, long enough for the message to be understood, and the man retreated into the darkness and vanished as if he had never been there. Dominic looked down at the ruined tires, looked at the note in Eve's hand, and he said nothing. He did not need to, because they both knew Eve had no other choice. He opened the rear door of his SUV and motioned for her to bring Lily inside, and Eve knew she was stepping into the territory of another devil, but between two devils she chose the one who had given her daughter a lucky coin and a smile instead of threats and terror. She carried Lily from the old car into Dominic's vehicle, and as the SUV door closed behind her, Eve did not know whether she had just been saved or whether she had pushed herself even deeper into hell. On the night of the wedding, Dominic drove Eve and her daughter all the way back to the dilapidated apartment in South Bronx, and when he saw where she lived, something flickered briefly in his steel-gray eyes that Eve did not want to call pity, but he said nothing, only handed her a black business card with a single phone number, printed in silver ink, and told her that if anything happened, anything at all, she was to call him immediately, and Eve took the card, meaning to say she did not need it, that she had taken care of herself for 4 years and did not need a mafia boss to save her, but instead she only nodded and said thank you, then carried Lily inside without looking back. 3 days after the wedding, Eve tried to live as if nothing had changed, as if she were not being threatened by one of the most dangerous mafia families in New York, as if the black card was not sitting in her wallet like a constant reminder that her life had veered onto a path she had never imagined. She went to work at the law firm during the day, picked Lily up from daycare in the afternoon, left her with her grandmother in the hospital so the child could play beside the sickbed, while Eve rushed off to work the night shift at the restaurant. Today was Tuesday. The deadline Salerno had given was Friday, 3 days away, and Eve still had no idea what she would do, no idea how she could possibly come up with $120,000 when she could barely afford this month's rent. Her shift ended close to 1 in the morning, and Eve was so exhausted her legs trembled as she boarded the last subway train home, her mind spinning with numbers and hopeless scenarios. She had considered running, taking Lily far away, but she knew Salerno had men everywhere, and she did not have the money to go anywhere far enough to be safe. When Eve pushed open the door to her apartment, she knew instantly that something was wrong, because the door was unlocked, even though she was certain she had locked it before leaving for work, and the sharp smell of spray paint hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. She reached for the light switch, and what she saw made it feel as though someone had punched her in the chest, her breath catching, her feet rooted to the floor. Her small apartment had been ransacked, furniture overturned, her closet flung open, with her cheap clothes ripped apart and scattered across the floor, and on the yellowing white wall of the living room, a message had been scrawled in red paint like blood. The deadline is over. Eve stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, staring at her destroyed home as if a storm had torn through it. And she thought of Lily, thought of what might have happened if her daughter had been here instead of at the hospital with her grandmother, and the thought made her feel sick. She stepped into Lily's bedroom, the one place she had hoped they would not touch. But that hope shattered the moment she saw Mr. Buttons, the stuffed bear Lily loved most, the one she hugged every night to fall asleep, lying on the bed with its belly slashed open, white stuffing spilling across the pink sheets like snow stained with blood. Eve sank to the floor, her knees hitting the cold ground, and for the first time in 4 years, she cried. She cried for herself, for the years spent struggling to survive, for a debt she had never taken on, for a failed marriage to a coward who had abandoned her and their daughter and left only ruins behind. But more than anything, she cried out of fear. Fear for Lily, fear that she could not protect her child, fear that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. Then her hand brushed against her wallet inside her coat pocket, and she felt the hard rectangle of the black card. She pulled it out and stared at the silver numbers gleaming under the flickering fluorescent light, and she knew she had no other choice, that pride and dignity meant nothing when weighed against her daughter's life. Eve dialed the number, her hand shaking so badly she had to try 3 times before she got it right, and when Dominic Marchetti's low voice answered after 2 rings, she did not know what to say. She only knew that she needed help. And for the first time in her life, she admitted that to another person. Her voice trembled as she told him what had happened, and on the other end of the line, Dominic was silent for a few seconds before speaking only one sentence in a voice cold as ice, yet carrying a promise she did not know whether to trust or fear. "I am coming now. Do not go anywhere. And from this moment on, no one is allowed to touch you or your daughter ever again." Dominic arrived within 20 minutes, and when Eve opened the door for him, she realized he had not come alone. Two large men in black suits standing guard in the hallway like stone statues, while Dominic stepped into the apartment, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over the wreckage, pausing on the red-painted words on the wall, then settling on the slashed, stuffed bear Eve was holding, as if she could somehow sew it back together for her daughter, and his jaw tightened so hard she could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. Yet he said nothing about her miserable apartment, nothing about the obvious poverty reflected in every cheap, ruined possession. He simply stepped closer, placed a hand on her shoulder with an unexpected gentleness, and told her she needed to leave immediately, that he would take her somewhere safe, and that she had 10 minutes to pack only what was absolutely necessary. Eve wanted to argue, wanted to say she did not need anyone's charity, but when she looked down at the torn bear in her hands, at the white stuffing spilling like snow onto the floor, she only nodded and began gathering what clothes were still intact into an old duffel bag. They stopped at the hospital to collect Lily from her grandmother's room, and Eve lied to her mother, saying she had an urgent work trip and would leave Lily with a trusted friend for a few days, and her mother, pale from chemotherapy and exhausted by illness, looked at Dominic standing in the doorway with quiet suspicion but asked no questions, only kissed Lily's forehead and told her to listen to her mother. Lily slept in Eve's arms as they climbed into the sleek black SUV, waking only when the car stopped in front of Marchetti Tower in Manhattan, a building Eve had only ever seen in business magazines she skimmed while doing bookkeeping at the law firm, a glass and steel skyscraper reflecting the city lights like a lighthouse in a forest of concrete. And when Eve looked up at its peak, she felt smaller than she ever had before. A private elevator took them straight to the top, and when the doors opened, Eve took an involuntary step back, overwhelmed by a sight utterly foreign to everything she had known in her 27 years of life. Dominic Marchetti's penthouse occupying an entire floor, with soaring ceilings and walls of glass revealing Manhattan spread below like a sea of stars. White marble floors polished to a mirror sheen, minimalist furnishings, radiating a level of luxury she did not dare imagine the cost of, and at the center of the living space, a massive aquarium glowing blue like a fragment of ocean captured inside the city. Lily, still groggy moments before, became fully awake at the sight of the tank, slipping from Eve's arms to press her face to the glass, her wide eyes reflecting the shimmering light as she exclaimed in wonder that there was Nemo in there, that there was Dory too, and Eve did not know whether to laugh or cry as she watched her daughter. Dominic stood beside her, observing Lily's reaction with a faint smile Eve had never seen on his face before, and he told Eve that he had prepared a private suite for them, that there was a bedroom for her and a smaller bedroom for Lily, decorated in soft purple, because he did not know what color the child liked, but his niece usually loved purple. Eve wanted to ask why a single man had a child's bedroom in his penthouse, but Dominic explained before she could speak that his sister sometimes brought her child to visit, and he kept the room for occasions like that. He led them down a long hallway lined with paintings Eve guessed were originals rather than reproductions, into a separate wing of the penthouse, set far from his own bedroom, a silent promise that he would respect her privacy. Eve's room overlooked Central Park through floor-to-ceiling glass, with silk sheets and oak furniture she was almost afraid to touch for fear of staining or damaging them, while Lily's room next door was smaller but warm and inviting, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and a purple stuffed dragon waiting on the bed as if for its new owner. Lily hugged the dragon immediately, forgetting Mr. Buttons, forgetting the wrecked apartment, forgetting everything frightening, because to a 4-year-old child the world could become beautiful again, with nothing more than a new toy and an aquarium full of Nemo fish. Eve stood in the doorway watching her daughter curl up on a bed softer than anything she had ever known, a sharp ache piercing her chest because she could not give her child these things through her own strength alone, and Dominic stood behind her, his voice gentle as he said she should rest, that they would talk about their arrangement in the morning once she was calmer. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Eve alone with her daughter, and with 1,000 questions circling her mind about whether she had just stepped into a lion's den, and whether she would emerge from it intact. The next morning Eve woke in the unfamiliar room with sunlight pouring through the glass and falling directly across her face, and it took her several seconds to remember where she was, why she was lying on the softest bed she had ever known, and why her daughter was not beside her. Panic jolting through her as she sprang up and rushed into Lily's room, only to release a shaky breath of relief when she found the child still asleep, arms wrapped tightly around the purple stuffed dragon, her face peaceful as if the nightmares of the past days had never existed. And Eve stood there watching her for a long moment before quietly closing the door and going to find Dominic, because she knew the conversation he had mentioned the night before could no longer be delayed. She found him in the study at the end of the hallway, a room lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling, and a walnut desk positioned before a window overlooking Manhattan bathed in early morning light, and Dominic looked up as she entered, still wearing the same suit from the night before, as if he had not slept at all, as if he had spent the entire night dealing with matters she did not want to imagine. He motioned for her to sit in the leather chair across from his desk, and as she did, she felt as though she were attending a job interview for a position she was not sure she wanted, and he began by telling her he had spent the night thinking about her situation, and that he had a proposal he believed would benefit them both, a purely business arrangement that, if she accepted, would resolve every problem she was facing. And Eve listened in silence, her hands gripping the armrests to keep herself from standing up and walking away, because she knew that whatever this deal was, she did not truly have the right to refuse. Dominic laid it out clearly and methodically, as if presenting to a board of directors, rather than speaking to a desperate woman, explaining that Eve would play the role of his fiancée for 3 months, appear with him at social events, live in the penthouse under his protection, and show the outside world that she was the woman Dominic Marchetti had chosen, and in return, he would pay the entire $120,000 debt left by her ex-husband, cover all of her mother's medical expenses, including transferring her to a better hospital with top specialists, and ensure that Salerno would never again be able to touch her or Lily. After 3 months, when the arrangement ended, she would be free to leave with enough money to start a new life wherever she wished, and he would demand nothing further from her. Eve sat there trying to process what she had just heard, and the first question that escaped her was why. Why he would help her, what he stood to gain, because she did not believe a man like Dominic Marchetti ever did anything without purpose. And he studied her for a long moment, his steel-gray eyes as unreadable as ever, before telling her a truth she had not expected, explaining that Salerno was an enemy of the Marchetti family, that the feud went back to his father's generation, and that Salerno's attempt to use her to get closer to people in Dominic's circle, like Marcus, Sophia's husband, was a move he could not ignore, and by making her his fiancée, he would not only protect her but remove Salerno's pawn, sending a clear message that anyone under Marchetti protection was untouchable. But that was not the only reason, he continued, his voice carrying a trace of weariness she had not anticipated, as he spoke of the constant pressure from allied families demanding he marry their daughters to strengthen alliances, of political marriages he despised because they reduced women to bargaining chips between powerful houses, and if he had a fiancée, a woman he chose rather than one forced upon him, he would have a legitimate reason to refuse those offers without provoking conflict, making Eve the perfect solution to his problems, just as he would be the solution to hers. Eve remained silent for a long time, weighing what he had said, what she would give up, and what she would gain, and realizing that this was fairer than anything she could have hoped for in her position, and when she asked about rules and boundaries, and what he expected beyond public appearances, Dominic was clear that this was a business arrangement, not a real relationship, that he expected nothing physical or emotional from her, that she was free to keep her private life, and he would respect her space, that she and Lily would have their own area in the penthouse, that she could continue working at the law firm, or quit if she wished, and that he would see Lily cared for and protected as if she were his own child. Eve searched his steel-gray eyes for deception or hidden motives, and found only honesty, and perhaps something like respect she had never expected to see in a Mafia boss. And she thought of Lily sleeping in the purple room, of her mother lying in a hospital bed awaiting more chemotherapy, of the debt hanging over her like a blade ready to fall at any moment. And she knew her answer, meeting Dominic's gaze and telling him she agreed, that she would play his fiancée for 3 months, and that she hoped neither of them would regret this decision. The first week in Dominic Marchetti's penthouse passed like a dream Eve could not decide was beautiful or terrifying, because everything around her was so far removed from the life she had known for 27 years, waking each morning in a sun-drenched room with silk sheets she was afraid to wrinkle, walking through hallways lined with paintings she did not dare study for too long for fear her gaze might somehow damage them, and eating breakfast in a dining room overlooking Central Park, a view she had once only glimpsed, through fences on the rare afternoons she had time to take Lily for a walk, while Dominic arranged a private tutor for Lily so she would not have to attend a public daycare where Salerno could reach her easily, stationed a security team on duty, 24 hours a day outside the penthouse, and provided a bank account Eve could use for any personal expense, which she refused to touch because she did not want to owe him anything beyond what their agreement already required. What surprised Eve most was not the luxury of her new surroundings, but the way Dominic treated Lily, because she had prepared herself for him to ignore her daughter, to see the child as an inconvenience attached to the deal. Yet reality was the opposite, as every morning, no matter how busy he was, Dominic made time to eat breakfast with them, listening as Lily talked about her dreams, about the purple dragon she had named Sparkle, about the fish in the aquarium she had named one by one, with a patience Eve had never imagined a Mafia boss could possess. And Lily, who had become shy with strangers after witnessing her parents fight and watching her father leave, opened up to Dominic with astonishing ease, so that by the third day in the penthouse she was calling him Mr. Dom, with an affection that sounded as though she had known him all her life. Every night before bed, Lily ran to find Dominic and demanded magic tricks, her wide eyes shining with the anticipation only children have when waiting for wonder. And Dominic, the man New York feared, the man rumored to have ordered countless deaths, would kneel to Lily's eye level and make the coin vanish and reappear in impossible places, from behind her ear, from the pocket of her pajamas, from inside Sparkle the dragon, while Lily's laughter echoed through the penthouse like the strangest sound the place had ever known. And Eve stood in the doorway watching this ritual each night, feeling a growing sense of unease because the image before her contradicted everything she believed she knew about Dominic Marchetti, leaving her unsure which version of him was real. He could be gentle and endlessly patient with Lily one moment, then moments later Eve would hear him on the phone, his voice turning cold as ice as he issued orders about things she did not want to understand. He could smile at Eve across the breakfast table, ask if she had slept well and if she needed anything, then disappear for the entire day to deal with matters she was certain had nothing to do with legitimate real estate. And Eve reminded herself daily that this was only a business arrangement, that Dominic was not a good man, that the tenderness he showed Lily might simply be part of the performance. Yet every time she saw him smile at her daughter, every time she watched him patiently explain why the sky was blue or how fish could breathe underwater, she felt her resolve weaken just a little more. One night, unable to sleep, Eve went to the living room for a glass of water and found Dominic sitting alone beside the aquarium, blue light washing over his face and softening the sharp, dangerous lines of it, unaware she was there, holding the lucky coin he had given Lily at the wedding, the same coin Lily had returned to him after saying Mr. Dom needed it more because Mr. Dom did not have a mother to hug him at night. And Eve remembered that moment, remembered the way Dominic had gone still when Lily said it, remembered the flicker in his steel-gray eyes that she guessed was pain before he masked it with a smile, and she turned back to her room without taking any water, lying awake that night staring at the ceiling, wondering who Dominic Marchetti truly was, and why she was beginning to care about the answer. 2 weeks after moving into Dominic Marchetti's penthouse, he informed Eve that it was time for them to make their public debut as fiancé and fiancée, and that their first appearance would be a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum, a place where the wealthiest and most powerful people in New York would gather to donate money to poor children while sipping champagne that cost more than a month's rent for the very lives they claimed to be helping. And although Eve knew this was an unavoidable part of their arrangement, she still felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest at the thought of standing under bright lights beside a man like Dominic Marchetti, pretending to love him in front of hundreds of sharp, judging eyes from high society. That afternoon, a delivery arrived at the penthouse, a large black box bearing the logo of a luxury fashion house Eve had only ever seen in magazines, and when she opened it, she found a deep red evening gown made of silk and lace, so beautiful that she was almost afraid to touch it. Dominic appeared in her doorway as she stood staring at the dress in stunned silence, telling her he had asked a stylist to choose it based on measurements he had guessed, and that if it did not fit, he would have another one sent immediately. And Eve wanted to refuse, wanted to say she did not need something so expensive, but she knew she could not stand beside Dominic Marchetti in an old black dress from a thrift store, so she only nodded and thanked him, trying not to think about how many months of her salary the gown might cost. When Dominic handed her a smaller box containing a diamond necklace, earrings, and bracelet that she was certain were worth more than her old apartment, Eve shook her head and refused at once, telling him she would wear the dress because it was necessary for the act, but she could not wear real jewelry, that she did not want to owe him anything beyond what they had agreed upon, and that she did not want to forget who she was just because she was wrapped in things that did not belong to her. Dominic studied her for a long moment with an expression she could not read, then nodded and said he would have replica jewelry brought in that looked no different from the real thing, and that he respected her decision, surprising Eve because she had been bracing herself for an argument, and his easy acceptance only deepened her confusion about the man he truly was. That evening, when she stepped out of her room in the red gown that hugged her body, her hair swept up and her makeup light and self-applied because she was not comfortable with strangers touching her face, Dominic was waiting in the living room in a black three-piece suit, and she saw him pause for a fraction of a second when he looked at her, his steel-gray eyes widening slightly before he masked his reaction with a polite smile, telling her she looked beautiful in a tone that left her unsure whether it was courtesy or sincerity. The gala at the Metropolitan Museum was more dazzling than anything Eve had ever imagined, with enormous crystal chandeliers illuminating gallery halls transformed into ballrooms, ancient statues standing silently like watchful guests, and hundreds of the city's richest people, sipping champagne and discussing million-dollar deals as casually as the weather. And when Eve entered on Dominic's arm, her hand resting where he had instructed her in the car, she felt a ripple of whispers spread through the room like water across a still pond. People looking at her, then at Dominic, then back at her with undisguised curiosity, fragments of murmured questions, drifting past her ears asking who she was, saying they had never seen her at any event before, wondering if Marchetti was finally engaged, asking where she had come from. Eve forced herself to remain composed, to keep a soft smile on her lips, and her chin lifted as Dominic had taught her, even though inside she wanted to fold in on herself and disappear into the nearest wall. And Dominic seemed to sense her tension because he placed a hand at her back, gentle yet firm, and strangely, that touch calmed her instead of making her more anxious. They moved through the room as Dominic introduced her to businessmen and politicians she had previously only seen on television, and whenever someone asked how they had met, Dominic smiled and said it was a secret, that some of the most beautiful love stories were the ones that did not need to be told, and the way he spoke almost made Eve believe it herself, forcing her to remind herself that he was acting, that everything he did was part of the performance. Near midnight, as Eve stood alone beside the drinks table, while Dominic stepped away to speak with an important business partner, a middle-aged man in a white suit with a face flushed from alcohol approached her, introducing himself as the chairman of some corporation whose name Eve did not bother to remember, and began making crude, flirtatious remarks he likely believed were charming. Eve politely declined and tried to move away, but he grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer, his breath heavy with liquor as he told her a woman like her should not refuse attention from a man like him, that he could offer her far more than Marchetti if she knew what was good for her. And in that moment Eve felt herself dragged back to the wedding night when Michael had grabbed her in the hallway, and as she was about to wrench her hand free and scream, the man was suddenly yanked away from her with such force that he nearly fell. Dominic stood between Eve and the drunken man, his back to her like a shield, and though she could not see his face, she could imagine it from the way the other man trembled like a leaf in a storm. And Dominic did not raise his voice, did not create a scene. He spoke only a few quiet, measured words. Eve could not hear from where she stood, yet whatever he said drained the color from the man's face, leaving him stammering apologies before he fled toward the exit as if chased by demons. Dominic turned back to Eve, his steel-gray eyes still dark with unspent anger, and asked if she was all right, his voice controlled but carrying an edge of concern she had not expected. And Eve nodded, saying she was fine, and as he placed his hand at her back once more and guided her away from the room, she realized she felt safe in a way she had not felt since Michael left, and that realization frightened her more than any threat Salerno could make, because she was beginning to trust a man she knew was dangerous, and she had no idea where that trust would ultimately lead her. 3 weeks had passed since the gala, and Eve was beginning to grow accustomed to this strange life, accustomed to waking each morning in a luxurious room, accustomed to having breakfast with Dominic while he asked how she had slept as if he genuinely cared, accustomed to watching Lily run to hug his leg every night and demand magic tricks as an indispensable ritual before bedtime. And she and Dominic had appeared together at several more events, each time drawing the attention of the press and the curious scrutiny of high society. And she had begun to settle into the role of his fiancé, accustomed to the way he placed his hand at her back, accustomed to the way he looked at her as though she were the only woman in the room, even though she knew it was all an act. Yet there was one thing she could not grow used to, the way her heart beat faster whenever he was near, the way she began to look forward to their brief moments together, and she hated herself for it. That night, Eve woke close to 2 a.m. for no clear reason, as if something had pulled her out of sleep, a faint sound or an instinct she could not explain, and she lay still in the darkness for a while, before giving up on sleep and deciding to go to the living room for a glass of water. And that was when she saw him. Dominic was sitting on the sofa facing the aquarium, the blue light from the tank the only illumination in the room, and in that dim glow she saw dark stains spreading across his white shirt that she recognized as blood, and he did not see her standing in the hallway doorway. Or perhaps he did and did not care. He simply sat there watching the fish drift through the water as if he were somewhere far away. And Eve noticed he was clutching his left arm, where a deep cut was still bleeding through the fabric. She did not know what she should do, whether she should turn back to her room and pretend she had seen nothing, whether she should ask what had happened, whether she should call for help. But then she remembered everything Dominic had done for her over the past weeks, the way he had protected her from Salerno, the way he treated Lily as if she were his own child, the way he never demanded anything beyond what they had agreed upon, and she realized she could not leave him sitting there bleeding alone in the dark. She went into the bathroom and retrieved the first aid kit she had noticed in the cabinet, then walked to Dominic and sat beside him without a word, and when he looked up at her his eyes were so exhausted she barely recognized him. And when she gently moved his hand away from the wound to examine it, he let her, offering no resistance, as if he were too drained to do anything else. The injury was not too deep, but it needed stitches, and Eve told him so. But Dominic shook his head and said he did not want to call his private doctor at this hour. He did not want anyone to see him like this, and that she could simply bandage it for now. And Eve did not ask why, did not ask where the blood came from, did not ask what he had done or who had done this to him. She simply cleaned the wound with antiseptic, sealed it, and wrapped his arm carefully in gauze the same way she had done hundreds of times for the small injuries Lily collected growing up. When she finished, she started to stand and return to her room, to leave him alone with whatever ghosts were haunting him that night. But Dominic caught her hand with his uninjured one and asked in a rough voice whether she could stay a little longer, just for a moment. Eve sat back down, and they remained in silence for a long time, watching the fish glide through the tank, the blue light washing over their faces as if they were beneath the ocean. And then Dominic began to speak, his voice low and slow, as if he were telling a story he had never told anyone before. He spoke of the night his father was killed, 11 years earlier, when he was 25 years old and had just graduated from university with a degree in economics he had intended to use to turn his father's empire into a completely legitimate business. He spoke of the gunshots in the night, of running down the stairs to find his father lying on the floor in a pool of blood, of the way his father looked at him one last time and told him that now everything rested on his shoulders, that the Marchetti family needed a leader, and that he was the only one who could take that place. Dominic spoke of the choices he had to make after his father's death, choices no 25-year-old should have to face, of becoming someone entirely different to keep the family from collapsing, to protect his sister from enemies eager to exploit their weakness, to avenge his father's death. And he did not describe the details of what he had done, but Eve understood that his hands were not clean, that he had committed terrible acts to survive in the world he had been born into, and he did not ask her forgiveness or understanding. He was simply speaking, perhaps for the first time in his life, to someone who did not belong to that world. Eve did not know what to say. There were no words that fit the moment, so she did the only thing she could think of. She took his hand, the same hand that had reached for hers earlier, and held it tightly as a way of saying she was there, that she was listening, that whoever he was not alone tonight. They remained like that until dawn began to slip through the glass, hands still clasped, and no more words were spoken, yet something between them had shifted in that night. A wall had cracked, and Eve knew she could no longer see Dominic Marchetti as a cold, unfeeling mafia boss. He had become a real man with wounds and pain hidden behind steel-gray eyes, and that realization made everything far more complicated. 1 week after that night, Dominic suggested taking Eve and Lily to the family's vacation estate in the Hamptons for the weekend, explaining that it would both reinforce their image in front of business partners who were also spending time in the area, and give Eve the chance to meet his sister Valentina, who, he said, would want to see for herself who the woman beside her brother really was. And Eve agreed because she had no real reason to refuse, and because a small part of her, one she did not want to admit, was curious to see more of Dominic's life beyond the penthouse walls and glittering galas, the drive taking about 2 hours, with Lily bubbling with excitement the entire way, because she had never seen the ocean except in books. And when the black SUV turned onto the private road leading to the Marchetti estate, Eve had to force herself not to gape at the sight before her. The villa was not a house so much as a vast estate facing the sea, manicured lawns stretching like green velvet, and an outdoor pool that made Lily shriek with delight. Yet what unsettled Eve, more than the luxury, was the woman waiting at the front entrance. A woman around 28 with long black hair and the same gray eyes as Dominic, though where his eyes were cold like steel, hers were cold like ice and fixed on Eve with undisguised suspicion. Valentina Marchetti did not shake Eve's hand, did not smile, did not offer polite greetings. She simply looked Eve up and down as if appraising an item her brother had brought home, then turned to Dominic and asked something in Italian that Eve did not understand, but instinctively knew was not kind. Dominic answered his sister in English, perhaps deliberately so Eve could hear, telling her she should give Eve a chance before judging, and Valentina only shrugged and walked inside without another word. Lunch was uncomfortable, with Valentina firing sharp questions about Eve's past, her job, and why she was with her brother, which Eve answered as honestly as she could without revealing the true nature of her arrangement with Dominic, until the turning point came in the afternoon, when Lily ran up to Valentina by the pool and handed her a drawing she had just made, a crooked picture of a black-haired princess with the words, "Aunt Val," pretty scrawled in the trembling handwriting of a 4-year-old. And Eve watched Valentina freeze, then looked down at Lily with a softness she had not expected, and when Valentina crouched and asked Lily if she wanted her to teach her how to swim, Eve understood that her daughter had done what she herself could not, cracking the ice around Dominic's sister. That afternoon, while Valentina taught Lily to swim in the children's pool, Eve sat on the beach watching Dominic build a sandcastle with Lily, a bittersweet ache swelling in her chest as she took in the scene. Dominic kneeling in the sand, his expensive trousers undoubtedly ruined beyond repair yet entirely forgotten as he focused on following the instructions of a 4-year-old architect directing the project with solemn authority. And when the castle was finished, Lily squealed and threw her arms around him, declaring it the most beautiful castle in the world, and Mr. Dom the best castle builder in the world. And Eve saw Dominic smile, a real smile unlike any she had seen before, and her heart ached because she knew she was falling into a depth she had no way to climb out of. That night, after Lily was asleep and Valentina had retreated to her room after admitting she might have judged Eve too harshly and apologizing for her initial behavior, Eve walked alone along the beach to breathe the night air and try to untangle the chaos in her thoughts, not surprised to hear footsteps behind her and not turning when Dominic came to stand beside her, both of them gazing out at the dark ocean under the moonlight, silent for a long while until Dominic asked what she was thinking, and Eve did not know why she answered honestly, but she told him about her dream of opening a small bookshop, a place where she could spend her days with Lily reading and recommending stories to people who loved books as she did, telling him how she had loved books since childhood, how they had carried her through her hardest years, and how she had abandoned that dream when life forced her to be practical. Dominic listened, then spoke of his own dream, of wanting to be an architect, to design beautiful buildings, instead of owning them with money earned from work he was not proud of sketching hundreds of designs when he was younger, and hiding them in a box he still kept but never opened. And Eve saw the man beneath the Mafia boss, realizing they were more alike than she had thought, two people who had given up their dreams because of circumstance, both living lives they had not chosen. Dominic turned toward her, moonlight softening the hard lines of his face, and told her she deserved that bookshop, that she deserved everything she dreamed of, and the way he said it made Eve believe he meant it. He stepped closer, and Eve did not step back, could not step back, her feet rooted in the sand, and her heart pounding as the space between them disappeared. Dominic lifting a hand to touch her cheek as lightly as a butterfly's wing, leaning down until his lips were only centimeters from hers, his warm breath on her mouth, and his gray eyes dark with something she did not dare name. But just before their lips met, Eve stepped back, her hand pressing against his chest like a barrier, as she said in a trembling voice that this was not part of the agreement, that she could not do this, that she no longer knew what was real and what was pretend between them, and she was afraid that if she crossed this line, she would not be able to go back. Dominic stood still for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the darkness, then nodded and said he understood, that he was sorry if he had made her uncomfortable, before turning and walking back toward the villa, leaving Eve alone on the beach with a breaking heart, knowing she had done the right thing, and wishing desperately that she had not. The return trip to Manhattan after the weekend in the Hamptons was wrapped in a tension that both Eve and Dominic felt but neither of them mentioned, as if the almost kiss on the beach the night before had built an invisible wall between them that neither knew how to dismantle. Dominic sitting in the front seat beside the driver, while Eve sat in the back with Lily dozing in her arms, and during the 2-hour drive they exchanged fewer than 10 sentences, And when the SUV stopped in front of Marchetti Tower, and they stepped into the main lobby, Eve was about to lift Lily toward the elevator, when she froze, her body locking in place at the sight of a familiar figure rising from one of the waiting chairs and walking toward them. Michael Russo, her ex-husband, stood in the lobby of the most luxurious building in Manhattan in a cheap suit, his face smug as if he were holding a final card capable of overturning everything. Eve took a step back, instinct tightening her arms around Lily, and she felt Dominic stiffen beside her as he recognized who the man was. Michael smiled, the same smile Eve had loathed for 3 years, and announced triumphantly that he had hired a lawyer, that he was going to sue for custody of Lily because Eve was allowing their daughter to live in the home of a notorious criminal, that he had proof Dominic Marchetti was a Mafia boss, and that no court would allow a child to be raised in such an environment, that he would bring everything into the open, that the press would be very interested in the story of a single mother selling herself to a Mafia don, and that if Eve did not want to lose her daughter, she would be wise to pay him to keep quiet. Eve felt as if she had been slapped, not because of Michael's threats, but because of the sheer audacity of using the child he had never cared about as a hostage to extort her. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream that he had no right, that he was the one who had abandoned his daughter for 3 years, that he did not deserve to call himself a father, but before a single word could leave her lips, Dominic stepped forward, placing himself between her and Michael like a living wall. He did not shout. He did not make loud threats. He spoke in a voice so calm it was terrifying, each word falling like a cold stone into the silent lobby, saying that he knew Michael was working for Salerno to pay off his debt, that he knew Michael was the one who had tipped Salerno off about Eve's schedule, that he knew Michael had been paid to monitor his ex-wife and his own child. Dominic went on, his tone still conversational as if discussing the weather, saying that he also knew about the $30,000 Michael had embezzled from his former employer 2 years earlier without being discovered, about the 20-year-old mistress he was supporting in Queens, and about the forged documents he had used to rent his current apartment. Eve watched Michael's face drain from red to white, as Dominic calmly listed secrets Michael had believed no one knew, and she realized Dominic was not merely threatening him. He was showing him that he knew everything, that he could destroy Michael's life whenever he chose, and that Michael was utterly powerless in the face of that control. Dominic finished by saying that if Michael ever came within 100 meters of Eve or Lily again, he would not only deliver all of this information to the police and Michael's creditors, he would also make sure Salerno learned that Michael had planned to betray him by extorting the fiancée of Dominic Marchetti, and they both knew exactly how Salerno dealt with traitors. Michael could not speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish thrown onto land, before he turned and fled for the exit as if chased by ghosts. And Eve knew she would never see him again. When Michael was gone, Dominic turned back to Eve, and in his eyes she no longer saw the frightening coldness he had shown Michael, but worry and perhaps fear that she would see him differently after witnessing the way he had wielded his power. Eve stood still for a long moment, Lily still sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of what had just happened, and she thought about what she had seen. She had watched Dominic threaten Michael once before at the wedding, but this was different. This time she had seen the true danger he embodied, his ability to gather information on anyone and use it as a weapon, his absolute power to ruin a life with only a few sentences. She knew she should be afraid. She knew she should feel fear. Yet when she looked into Dominic's gray eyes and saw him waiting for her reaction like a defendant awaiting a verdict, she realized he had used every bit of that terrifying power to protect her and her daughter, and she no longer knew how that realization made her feel at all. The second month in Dominic Marchetti's penthouse passed like a dream Eve barely dared to believe was real, because for the first time in many years her life seemed to be moving in the right direction. Her mother had been transferred to the best private hospital in New York with a team of leading oncology specialists, and after the new round of treatment, the tests showed the tumor was shrinking, news that made Eve break down in sobs when the doctor told her. Lily was happier than she had ever been, fully adapted to the new life with her purple bedroom filled with toys, the Nemo aquarium she could watch for hours, the tutor who taught her to draw and read, and most of all Mr. Dom, whom she now loved as if he were an irreplaceable part of her family. The debt of $120,000 had been completely paid off. The threatening messages from Salerno had stopped entirely, and Eve no longer woke in the middle of the night in panic. The relationship between her and Dominic had also changed after the night on the beach in the Hamptons, and although neither of them ever mentioned that almost kiss, something was different in the way they looked at each other, in the way their hands brushed by accident and then pulled back too quickly, in the way they sat closer together on the sofa, while watching Lily perform dances she invented herself, and Eve began to look forward to their breakfasts together, to the evenings when Dominic came home early and performed magic for Lily, to the rare moments when they were alone and talked about things that had nothing to do with the arrangement or with Salerno, knowing she was falling into a depth she should not enter, knowing she was falling in love with a man she should never love, yet unable to stop her heart. And a small part of her began to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this was not only a business arrangement for Dominic. That morning began like any other, with sunlight flooding through the glass, and Lily's laughter echoing from the living room where she was watching cartoons with Sparkle the Dragon, Eve sitting alone at the breakfast table because Dominic had left early for work, opening her laptop to check emails from the law firm where she still worked remotely. And in her inbox there was an email from an unknown address with no subject line and only an attachment, Eve knowing she should not open such messages, knowing it could be a virus or spam, yet something compelled her to click, and when the file opened, her heart seemed to stop in her chest. It was a scanned copy of an old document, a typed agreement on letterhead bearing the names of both the Marchetti family and the Salerno family, dated 5 years earlier, with the signatures of Dominic Marchetti and Victor Salerno at the bottom. Eve read every line with trembling hands, and the contents felt as though the air had been ripped from her lungs. The document described a ceasefire agreement between the two families, the division of territory and business interests, mutual promises of non-aggression, but what shattered Eve was not the main text of the agreement. It was the handwritten note in the margin of the final page, written in a hand she had seen often enough on documents Dominic signed in the penthouse to recognize it as his. The note read that ER would be the perfect bait, and that access should be made through the Webb wedding. ER Evelyn Russo. Webb Marcus Webb, Sophia's husband, Dominic's university friend, the wedding where she had met Dominic for the first time. Eve sat staring at the laptop screen, feeling her world collapse piece by piece. Everything she had believed was real, the gentle moments, the looks she thought were sincere, the care she believed came from genuine feeling. All of it was false. All of it part of a plan Dominic and Salerno had laid out 5 years earlier. She was not a lucky woman protected by a mafia boss. She was a pawn in a game she never knew she was playing. Bait Dominic had deliberately chosen to serve a purpose she did not understand. That night at the wedding, when he appeared beside her at table 19, had not been coincidence or fate but a calculated move. Everything from beginning to end had been a lie. Eve closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time, struggling to control the pain, tearing through her chest from the inside. She had been betrayed by Michael, the man she once loved and married, and she thought she had learned her lesson. Thought she would never trust anyone enough to be hurt like that again. But she had been wrong. She had allowed Dominic Marchetti into her life, into her heart, and now she was paying the price for her naivety. Tears streamed down her cheeks without her bothering to wipe them away, as she looked toward the living room where Lily was laughing at her cartoons, unaware that the life she had loved for the past 2 months was about to end, because Eve would not stay another day in the home of the man who had deceived her, even if it meant facing Salerno alone. Even if it meant losing everything she had just gained. Eve waited all day for Dominic to come home, and with every passing hour the anger and pain inside her grew heavier, like a fire fed with fresh fuel, because she had printed the document and read it again and again dozens of times, searching desperately for any other explanation for that handwritten note. But there was none. The handwriting was unmistakably Dominic's, and its meaning could not be misunderstood. And she packed her and Lily's belongings into the same worn duffel bag she had brought here 2 months earlier, waiting with the grim patience of someone who had already decided that no matter what happened, she would leave this place tonight. When Dominic walked into the penthouse close to 7 in the evening, a smile flickered across his face when he saw her standing in the living room, but it vanished instantly when he took in her expression and the duffel bag at her feet. And Eve said nothing. She simply hurled the stack of printed pages at him, the papers scattering through the air before drifting down onto the marble floor like autumn leaves, and she watched him bend to pick one up, read it, and go pale in the space of a heartbeat. He looked up at her, steel gray eyes widening with something she did not want to call panic, and he began to say it was a forgery, that he had never written that note, that someone was trying to drive them apart and she should not believe what she was reading. But Eve had heard too many lies in her life to believe any of it. She had believed Michael when he said he loved her, believed him when he promised he would stay forever, and she knew exactly where that faith had led her. She cut Dominic off with a voice as cold as ice, asking whether he denied that it was his handwriting, asking whether he denied that he had known about her before the wedding, asking whether he denied that he had appeared at table 19 that night with a purpose already planned. And Dominic was silent for a moment too long before answering, a silence that told Eve everything she needed to know. He admitted he had known about her before the wedding, admitted he had deliberately approached her that night, but said the reason was not what the document claimed, that there was another truth he needed to explain, that if she gave him a chance he would tell her everything. Yet Eve did not want to hear any more, because she had listened to enough excuses and explanations from Michael to know that liars always had 1,000 ways to dress deception up as truth, and she would not be fooled again. She told Dominic she was leaving now, that their arrangement was over from this moment on, and that she no longer wanted his money or his protection. And Dominic stepped toward her, his voice pleading in a way she had never heard before, saying she could not go out alone because Salerno was still watching her, saying that whether she trusted him or not, the danger was real, saying he would never forgive himself if anything happened to her or Lily. But Eve backed away, avoiding his outstretched hand as if he were fire, and she had already been burned enough, and she said with a trembling but resolute voice that she would rather face Salerno than stay beside a man who had deceived her from beginning to end, that at least Salerno did not pretend to care before trying to destroy her. Eve called Lily from the playroom, and the little girl ran out, clutching Sparkle the dragon, wide eyes confused as she sensed the tension between her mother and Mr. Dom without understanding it. And when Eve told Lily they had to go, that they would not be staying here anymore, the child's face crumpled as she asked why, asked if they would come back, asked if Mr. Dom would come with them, and each question cut into Eve's heart like a blade. Dominic knelt to Lily's eye level, just as he had the first time he performed magic for her at the wedding, and told her that she and her mother needed to go away for a while, but that he would always remember his little princess, and he placed the lucky coin in her hand, the same coin she had once given back to him, saying that now she needed it more than he did. And Lily burst into tears and threw her arms around him, while Eve bit down until she tasted blood to keep herself from crying too. She pulled Lily from Dominic's embrace, lifted her into her arms, and stepped into the elevator without looking back. And as the doors slid shut, she saw Dominic standing there, his face an empty mask she could not read, and she wondered whether it was the expression of a man exposed as a liar, or of a man who had just lost something that mattered to him. When they left the building, Eve did not know that Dominic was standing at the penthouse window watching below, that he had already taken out his phone and called his people, giving orders in a voice stripped of emotion that Eve and Lily were to be followed and protected every hour of every day without her knowing, and that if anyone so much as touched a single hair on either of their heads, he would deal with that person himself. Eve returned to her old apartment in South Bronx with Lily that night, and when she opened the door and stepped inside, she realized that someone had cleaned and repaired the place while she was gone, the wall that once bore the red painted threat now freshly white, the destroyed furniture replaced with simple but complete new pieces, and she knew instantly that this was Dominic's doing, even though she did not want to admit it. And Lily cried through the entire first night, unable to understand why they had to leave the purple room with the Nemo aquarium, unable to understand why she could not see Mr. Dom anymore, while Eve could only hold her daughter and search in vain for words that could explain to a 4-year-old that sometimes adults hurt each other in ways no magic trick can fix. The next 3 days passed in exhaustion and strain, Eve barely sleeping as she startled at every sound outside the door, constantly checking her phone for new threats, yet nothing came, and that silence unsettled her even more, because she knew it was only the calm before a storm. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Eve went to pick Lily up from the public daycare nearby, where she had re-enrolled her because she could no longer afford a private tutor like at the penthouse, and they were walking along the sidewalk with Lily, excitedly telling her about a picture she had drawn that day. A picture of a sandcastle with a tall man she said was Mr. Dom, and Eve was forcing herself to smile through the ache in her throat when she heard a sickening thud behind them, turning just in time to see the 2 guards Dominic had assigned to her collapse onto the pavement with darts in their necks, and before she could scream, a black van screeched to a stop beside them, everything happening too fast for her to react, as the door flew open, and 2 men in dark clothes jumped out, one grabbing Eve, the other tearing Lily from her arms, and before she could scream, a rough cloth was pulled over her head and something was injected into her neck, the world blurring and then collapsing into total darkness. When Eve came to, she did not know how long she had been unconscious, only that she was in a filthy, dim room, her hands bound behind her to a wooden chair, her body aching as if she had been beaten while she was out, tasting blood in her mouth and feeling one side of her face swollen and throbbing as her vision slowly adjusted to the darkness, and she saw Lily. Her daughter was huddled in the corner, wide eyes flooded with tears and terror. both hands clenched tightly around the lucky coin Dominic had given her, as if it were the only thing protecting her in this nightmare. And Eve tried to call out to her, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper, and when Lily saw her mother awake, she began to sob, calling for her again and again, yet not daring to run to her because a man was standing guard at the door. The door opened, and a man entered, about 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair and eyes cold as a snake's. And Eve knew instantly this was Victor Salerno, the head of the rival Mafia family whose cruelty she had heard so much about in recent weeks, and Salerno looked at her with a smile she could only describe as poisonous, telling her that she had cost him a great deal of effort to find an opening while she was under Marchetti protection, but fortunately she had walked out of the lion's den on her own, and now he could finally use her for his true purpose, pulling out his phone and switching on the camera as he said he was about to send a small gift to his old friend Dominic Marchetti. In the penthouse in Manhattan, Dominic was sitting in his office with a gaunt face after 3 sleepless days when his phone vibrated with a video call from an unknown number. And the moment he answered, what he saw froze the blood in his veins. Eve bound to a chair, her face bruised and swollen, yet her gray-blue eyes fixed stubbornly on the camera, as if trying to tell him she was not afraid even as her body trembled. And in the corner of the room, Lily, the 4-year-old child he had spent 2 months protecting and loving, was crying uncontrollably, clutching the lucky coin he had given her like a final lifeline in the dark. And Salerno appeared in the frame and spoke to Dominic with triumphant satisfaction, saying that if Dominic wanted to see the mother and child alive, he would hand over every document related to Marchetti operations, step down from all leadership positions, and leave New York forever within 24 hours. Dominic stared at the phone screen until the call ended, and in that moment, everyone in his office witnessed something they had never seen in the 11 years he had led the Marchetti family, because Dominic's hands were shaking, not from fear but from a rage igniting at his core and spreading through his body like volcanic lava on the brink of eruption, and he hurled the phone into the glass wall, the crash echoing through the dead silence of the room, before he let out a roar like a wounded animal and swept everything from his desk with both arms, papers exploding into the air, an expensive laptop shattering against the marble floor, while the guards outside the door did not dare step in, because they knew Dominic Marchetti in this state was more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. Valentina heard the news and reached the penthouse within 20 minutes, and when she entered the wrecked office, she found her brother standing by the window with his back to her, staring out at the glittering sprawl of Manhattan below as if he were struggling to restrain the monster screaming inside his chest. And she had seen him face gunfire, betrayal, and threats countless times before, but she had never seen him like this, never seen his iron control fracture so completely. Valentina stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked what had happened. And when Dominic turned to face her, she saw something in his steel-gray eyes she had never expected. Not fury or hatred, but pain. The pain of a man watching the most precious thing in his life being threatened, while he was powerless to stop it. Dominic told her about Salerno's call, about Eve and Lily being taken, about the conditions Salerno had set, and when he finished, Valentina looked at him for a long moment before saying what no one else would dare say to Dominic Marchetti, that he loved her, her voice not a question but a certainty, that he loved Eve and the child, and that was why he was like this, not because Salerno had challenged his power, but because he was holding the people Dominic loved. Dominic did not deny it. He only looked at his sister with bloodshot eyes and said he would get them back, that he would burn the entire underworld to the ground if necessary, and that he would deal with Salerno himself for daring to touch what was his. Within the next hour, Dominic summoned the full force of the Marchetti family, his most trusted guards, professionally trained killers, contacts inside the police system, and hackers capable of tracing anyone's location within minutes, gathering them in an abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn that served as a hidden base. And when Dominic entered, more than 50 armed men stood at attention like soldiers awaiting orders from their general. Dominic faced them, his voice cold and razor-sharp as he said Salerno had crossed the line, that he had kidnapped Dominic's fiancée and an innocent child, and that tonight they would strike the Salerno stronghold in New Jersey to bring them home, stating clearly that he would lead the assault, that he would be the first through the door, and that no one was allowed to stop him. Dominic's second in command, a man named Marco who had served the Marchetti family since his father's time, stepped forward and said this was suicide, that Dominic was their leader and should not put himself in such danger. But Dominic fixed him with a look Marco had never seen in 11 years, and said that if Eve and Lily died because he did not reach them in time, then he did not need to live either, and there would be no further discussion. Valentina stood in the corner watching her brother plan the assault with the precision and ruthlessness she knew appeared only when he was protecting those he loved, and she understood that Eve had done what no one else had managed in 11 years. She had made Dominic Marchetti, the heartless Mafia boss, love someone enough to be willing to die for them. And as the Marchetti convoy rolled toward New Jersey through the night, Dominic sat in the front seat of the lead SUV with his hand clenched around his gun, his mind holding only one thought, that he would bring Eve and Lily home, even if it cost him his life. Salerno's lair was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of Newark, where flickering streetlights were too weak to conceal the shadows moving through the night, and Dominic led the assault with the precision of a strategist who had planned hundreds of battles. Yet inside him was a man racing against time to save the people he loved. Gunfire tearing through the darkness as the Marchetti forces clashed with Salerno's men, sparks flaring like lethal fireworks, and Dominic charged straight into the chaos without hesitation, the weapon in his hand roaring as he advanced toward the room intelligence had identified as the place where Eve and Lily were being held, dropping 2 men who blocked his path without a second thought, his body moving on instinct honed over more than a decade in the underworld, until he kicked open the final door, and the sight before him froze the blood in his veins. Salerno stood in the center of the room, one hand clamped around Lily's small arm, the other holding a gun pressed to the head of the terrified 4-year-old child who was screaming in fear, while Eve was bound to a chair a few meters away, her face bruised and swollen, yet her gray-blue eyes burning with defiance, as she saw Dominic enter. And Salerno laughed, the laugh of a madman who knew he held a card powerful enough to turn everything upside down, telling Dominic that if he took one more step the child would die, that he should drop his gun and kneel if he wanted his little princess to keep breathing. Dominic stood perfectly still, finger resting on the trigger, looking into Lily's eyes, and seeing the lucky coin still clenched in her tiny hand despite her shaking fear, and his heart felt torn apart because he could not fire while Lily was in the line of sight. Eve saw him standing there, saw the helplessness on his face, and she knew she had to do something. She could not let her daughter die in the hands of this madman, could not force Dominic into an impossible choice between saving Lily and protecting himself, and she remembered what Dominic had taught her in the weeks at the penthouse about self-defense, lessons she never thought she would need, and she began to scream as if she were panicking, her cries piercing the small room, thrashing against the chair like someone unhinged. And just as she hoped, Salerno was distracted for a single second, only 1 second, turning his head to shout at her to be quiet, and that second was all Dominic needed as he raised his gun and fired, the bullet tearing through Salerno's right shoulder, making him howl in pain and release Lily, who ran to Dominic as if he were the only safe place left in the world. Dominic caught Lily with one arm, his gun still trained on Salerno writhing on the floor, and he was about to fire a second shot to end everything, when another gunshot rang out from the doorway, one of Salerno's men having slipped in through an emergency exit and fired at them, and Dominic reacted on instinct, twisting his body to shield Lily and Eve, the bullet punching through his left shoulder, with a dull impact that made him stagger but not fall, and he kept Lily close, standing firm between her and the danger, returning fire, and dropping the attacker with a single shot, even as blood poured from his shoulder, soaking his shirt. Marchetti's men flooded the room seconds later, subduing Salerno as he crawled toward his fallen gun, and Marco rushed to Dominic's side, his face draining of color at the sight of the wound. Dominic set Lily down and told Marco to take her outside, then staggered to Eve, his hands shaking as he untied her. And when the last binding fell away, Eve collapsed into his arms, sobbing against his chest without caring. That blood from his wound was soaking into her hair, apologizing, saying she had been wrong not to trust him, saying she had been naive to think she could protect her daughter alone, and Dominic only held her tighter, though the pain in his shoulder burned like a blade driven into flesh, whispering that he forgave her, that he understood why she had doubted, that all that mattered was that she and Lily were safe. And then the world began to spin, as blood loss robbed him of his strength. And the last thing he saw before darkness took him was Eve's face, gray-blue eyes filled with tears and fear, and he thought that if this were the final image he ever saw, it would not be a terrible way to leave the world. Dominic woke in a room washed entirely in white, filled with the familiar antiseptic scent of a hospital, and the first thing he registered was the deep, aching pain radiating from his left shoulder down his arm, but the second sensation made that pain irrelevant, a warm hand clasping his, small fingers threaded through his, as if afraid that letting go would make him disappear. And when he slowly opened his eyes, the first image he saw was Eve sitting beside the bed, her face still marked with bruises from Salerno's beating, but her gray-blue eyes fixed on him with an emotion he did not dare name. For fear he was dreaming. Exhausted as though she had not slept for days, dark circles shadowing her eyes, hair tangled as if she had not bothered to brush it. Yet to Dominic she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. When Eve realized he was awake, she began to cry, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she told him he had been unconscious for 2 days, that the doctors said the bullet had narrowly missed an artery, and that he had lost a great deal of blood, that she had thought she would lose him before she ever had the chance to tell him she had been wrong. And Dominic tried to smile through cracked, dry lips, his voice hoarse as he said he was hard to kill, that he had promised to protect her and Lily, and he was not the kind of man who broke his word. Eve cried harder at that, apologizing over and over for not trusting him, for leaving, for pushing herself and their daughter into danger because of her doubts, and Dominic tightened his grip on her hand, telling her she had nothing to apologize for, that he understood why she had reacted the way she did after what Michael had done to her. The door opened, and Valentina stepped in carrying a thick folder, explaining that it contained the results of an investigation conducted by the best hackers the Marchetti family possessed, and as she sat on the other side of the bed she explained what they had uncovered while Dominic was unconscious, that the email containing the forged document had been traced back to the IP address of the apartment where Michael Russo was living in Queens, proving that Eve's ex-husband had collaborated with Salerno to drive a wedge between her and Dominic, that Salerno had promised to erase Michael's debts if he succeeded in making Eve leave Marchetti protection, and that the easiest way to do so was to destroy her trust in Dominic. The ceasefire agreement between the Marchetti and Salerno families from 5 years earlier was real, Valentina continued, but the handwritten note had been added later, a forgery of Dominic's handwriting, created by a professional document falsifier Salerno had hired, and most importantly, as she opened the folder and showed Eve the original document recovered from the family archives, the initials ER did not exist in any note on the authentic agreement, and even if they had, they would have referred to the eastern region the two families had agreed to divide, not to Evelyn Russo, as the fake document had intended Eve to believe. Valentina looked at Eve with eyes no longer icy as they had been when they first met in the Hamptons, and said that her brother had never known Eve existed until he began investigating Salerno's operations and discovered that her ex-husband had borrowed money from the Marchetti family's enemy, that Dominic had attended the wedding with the original intention of warning Marcus about a potential link between his wife's family and Salerno, but the moment he saw Eve sitting alone at table 19, everything changed. Dominic looked at Eve, and for the first time since they met he spoke the truth he had kept hidden for 2 months, telling her he had not planned to speak to her that night, not planned to approach her, not planned to do anything beyond completing his task and leaving, but when he saw her sitting there in that old black dress, her eyes proud despite her obvious loneliness and fear, he could not walk away, that he had been drawn to her from the first moment not because she was beautiful but because she looked at him without fear, knowing exactly who he was, not because she was weak and needed protection but because of her resilience in the face of hardship, that while their arrangement may have begun as a business agreement, somewhere between shared breakfasts, evenings of magic tricks for Lily, and moments on the Hamptons beach, he had fallen in love with her, in a way he had never loved anyone in his 36 years. Eve was crying openly now when the door burst open and a small whirlwind rushed in, Lily running to the bedside, eyes shining when she saw Mr. Dom awake, climbing onto the bed to hug him despite Valentina's anxious warnings to be careful of his injury, pressing the lucky coin into his hand, and telling him it had protected them just as he promised, then giving him a handmade card drawn with colored paper and crayons, the crooked letters declaring that Mr. Dom was her hero and that she loved him. Dominic looked at the card, at the child curled beside him on the hospital bed, then at Eve standing there with tears and a smile on her face at the same time, and he knew that even though the bullet had nearly taken his life and recovery would take weeks, it had all been worth it, because for the first time in his life, he had a real family waiting for him. 6 months after the terrifying night in the Newark warehouse, Eve's life had changed in ways she would never have dared to imagine during her darkest days, and this morning she stood in front of a small bookstore in Brooklyn that Dominic had bought for her, the wooden sign carved with the name Lily Corner, swaying gently above the door in the spring breeze. Tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at a dream she had buried for years now, standing alive before her. The shop was not large, just enough space for a few shelves and a cozy reading corner with soft armchairs. Yet to Eve it was an entire universe she could finally call her own. She had chosen every book by hand, arranged every corner herself, and placed a children's shelf by the window, where sunlight poured in so children like Lily could sit there and discover the magic of stories. She glanced down at her left hand, where the engagement ring sparkled in the morning light. A diamond not overly large but surrounded by smaller stones shaped like a flower, a design Dominic had said he personally sketched and commissioned just for her. The proposal had taken place 1 month earlier on the Hamptons beach, where they had almost kissed for the first time. And this time Eve did not step back. This time she said yes before Dominic could even finish the question, while Lily jumped with joy at the thought that Mr. Dom would officially become her father. Eve's mother had been there that night as well, her health nearly fully restored after the final round of treatment, and she had cried as she watched her daughter finally find happiness after so many years of pain. Salerno had died in prison while awaiting trial, officially from a stroke, and Eve did not ask, and Dominic did not explain. There were things in his world she had learned to accept without needing every detail. Michael had disappeared too, rumored to have fled New York after Salerno's downfall, and Eve no longer cared where he was. He had become a ghost of the past she refused to let haunt her anymore. Lily's laughter drifted from the small yard behind the bookstore, and Eve stepped out the back door to watch a scene she never tired of seeing. Dominic kneeling on the grass, his expensive suit undoubtedly streaked with dirt, yet he did not care at all, completely focused on building a sandcastle in the sandbox he had installed there, so Lily could play whenever she came to the shop with her mother. Lily was directing the project with the seriousness of a tiny architect, and Dominic followed every instruction with an endless patience that still amazed Eve each time she saw it. The lucky coin now hung around Lily's neck as a necklace. Dominic had it mounted on a small silver chain, so she could carry it everywhere, and Lily proudly told everyone it was her treasure, the thing that had protected her and her mother from bad people. A red sports car pulled up in front of the bookstore, and Valentina stepped out holding a bouquet of fresh flowers and a bottle of expensive champagne. A grand opening gift, she said, was from her and the entire Marchetti family. Valentina had become one of Eve's closest friends over the past 6 months, the two women finding an unexpected harmony in each other. And Valentina often came to the penthouse to spend time with Lily, whom she affectionately called her niece, even though they were not yet officially family. Eve hugged her and thanked her. Then they stood together watching Dominic and Lily play in the yard, and Valentina said she had never seen her brother this happy, that Eve had done what she once thought impossible, turning a cold Mafia boss into a man who knew how to love. That evening, after the bookstore closed and Lily slept soundly in her own room at the penthouse, Eve and Dominic stood on the balcony looking out over Manhattan, glittering below like a sea of stars. Dominic wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, and asked if she regretted anything about what had happened between them, about the thorn-filled road they had walked to reach this moment. Eve was quiet for a while, thinking of everything since the fateful wedding night at the Westmore Hotel, of pain and betrayal and fear, but also of love and healing and the happiness she had found. Then she turned in his arms, placed her hands on his chest, looked into the steel-gray eyes she had come to love, even knowing the terrible things those eyes had seen and done, and said she had only one regret, that he had not suggested pretending to be married much earlier. Dominic laughed, a deep, warm laugh she had learned to cherish. Then he bent down and kissed her beneath the star-filled Manhattan sky, a kiss sweet and full of promise for the future they would build together. Eve closed her eyes and let herself sink into the moment, knowing the road ahead would still hold challenges, knowing Dominic's world would never be entirely safe, but also knowing they would face everything together as a family. And when she opened her eyes and looked at the man she loved, she silently thanked fate for placing her at table 19 on Sophia's wedding night, alone and forgotten, because without that moment she would never have learned that sometimes a devil can become a guardian angel, and that the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the happiest endings. The story of Eve and Dominic is a testament to the idea that love can grow in the most unlikely places, that people can change when they find a reason worthy of change, and that true happiness comes when we dare to open our hearts, even after being hurt. Life is not always easy, and sometimes we must pass through darkness to find the light. But what matters is never giving up hope and never closing our hearts to new possibilities. And if this story touched your heart, please tap the like button and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss more moving stories each day. And share this video with those you love. We would truly love to hear how this story made you feel, and what it may have reminded you of in your own life. So please leave a comment below so we can read and respond to each heartfelt thought. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. We wish you and your family strength, joy, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.